What's up, guys? Thanks for tuning in, and today we're going to be talking about what exactly does it mean if you have this badge on your E90 generation BMW. So if you've never seen any of my other videos, this is my 2013 E92 335i. It's a 2013, so it's an LCI model. It has the N55 engine instead of the N54, and yes, of course, as we talked about in the intro, it is an xDrive car, so it is all-wheel drive. So if you know anything about the 3 Series BMWs, you'll know that they're primarily rear-wheel drive cars. The chassis is set up for a rear-wheel drive system, and that still remains the same even on the all-wheel drive, the xDrive E90s. What changes really is how they send some of that power up to the front. So because of that rear-wheel drive foundation, the rear components of the drivetrain on these xDrive cars is still pretty much exactly the same as the rear-wheel drive variants. So that's talking about control arms, differential, subframe, all that sort of stuff on the rear of the car is exactly the same as the rear-wheel drive version. The difference is when you come up to the front. So the way this all-wheel drive system works, there's a ton of different systems and you can look into that separately, but this system has a transfer case around the transmission of the car. The transfer case then sends power through a front drive shaft up to a front differential that sits between the front 2 wheels of the car, and then you have 2 front axles going out from that differential to power the front wheels. So in a sense, this all-wheel drive system is somewhat similar to how a 4-wheel drive system on a truck might work, using that transfer case, that front drive shaft, and those front axles. However, this system is designed to be an all-time all-wheel drive system. The car never shifts really into just rear-wheel drive. It does have a rear-wheel drive bias, and what I mean by that is the all-wheel drive system does send most of the power to the rear wheels. I believe it's a 60-40 split, and that is variable depending on how the driving conditions are occurring and the manner of your driving. That can change, and the transfer case can adjust how much power gets sent to each of the axles. So then what does that all mean in terms of the actual ownership experience of the car? Well, first of all, with those added components, there are added maintenance items. So you have your transfer case, you have your front diff. Those fluids need to be changed along with the other fluids of the car at certain intervals. You have front axles, CV axles, the joints can go bad. You might need to replace one of those. So that's something to consider. And another thing to consider is the fact that those extra components add an additional 200 pounds to the car. So they do weigh a bit more than their rear-wheel drive counterparts, and sometimes if you're buying one of these cars for the sportiness of it and you're going to be driving it hard and pushing it to the limits, sometimes yes, you do feel that weight. And BMWs are known for their 50-50 weight distributions from the front to the rear axle because of those extra components, most of them being in the front of the car. That 50-50 weight distribution isn't quite there, and the front of these all-wheel drive models are a bit heavier. Another thing to consider is the suspension. Typically with the 3 Series, there's a base suspension and a support suspension if you get a sport package. So with the sport suspension, it would be a bit lower, it's a bit stiffer, and it's going to handle a bit better. That's not the case in the E90 generation with the xDrive cars. Regardless of what sport packages you have, it's always the same base xDrive suspension. So as you can see, my car is a factory M Sport car, so it has the M Sport package. But the suspension that I have here is the exact same suspension that you would have on a base, not really optioned out 3 Series from this generation. You don't really see a whole lot going on in the back. The back, again, is very similar to how a base rear-wheel drive 3 Series would sit. So on the back here, there's what would probably be considered as a reasonable, adequate wheel gap for a stock base car. But the big thing here, and really my biggest issue with the suspension, aside from the handling portion, is the way that the front looks. On these E90s cars, what they had to do in order to lift up the front suspension, in order to get those front axles out to the hubs of the car, it really compromised the way that the front looks. And as you can see, the fender gap just looks strange. It looks way too high. It looks like a tractor. It doesn't really work with the lines of the car because everything's coming down and then it's just too high off the ground, and just that gap is huge. Now that gap is being somewhat visually exaggerated because I do have these small winter wheels on the car right now. These are 17s. I typically run 18s in the summertime, but a lot of people run 19s on these cars. 19s look really, really good and fill out the wheel wells pretty well. So it is being visually exaggerated, but the size, when you throw 18s on there, although it might look a little bit better, the size of that gap is still the same. And then the other portion of the suspension is the way that it handles. I'm personally not a big fan of the way that the suspension handles on the xDrive cars. Yes, it's still a good handling car, and yes, the car probably does handle better than most other cars out on the road, but I bought the car as more for the sporty side of it, and I didn't wait for a rear-wheel drive because I got a good deal on this one. So at the end of the day, that's a decision that I made, but I do have some issues with the way the xDrive suspension handles in terms of the amount of body roll, the way that it's kind of floaty and vague at high speeds if you're going fast on the highway, but it can also be super crashy and rough over bumps at the same time. I talk a lot about this, specifically talking about the suspension in my video, talking about the 5 things that I hate about this car. So if you want to hear more about that, go check out that video. So if you're like me, you'll probably be thinking, oh, I'll go to the aftermarket, get some aftermarket suspension in here, some coilovers, some lowering springs, maybe something like that, and that'll fix that wheel gap. We'll be able to lower things down. But the one thing that I will say, that there are not a whole lot of aftermarket offerings for the xDrive cars. And a lot of that is because this front suspension can be quite complicated to engineer an aftermarket solution for and still account for the front axle, still have enough travel space for the suspension to move over bumps in the road and all that sort of thing. I will be making a separate video talking about the different options that are out there and the option that I'm ultimately going to end up doing on this car. But just know there are significantly less options for this car than there are for the rear-wheel drive car if you are going to get one of these cars and plan on changing the suspension. So for example, on a rear-wheel drive 3 Series, non-M3 3 Series, a typical upgrade someone might do is to put the M3 version front control arms on their 335i or their 328, whatever it is. And that's considered a really good upgrade. You get a lot better turn in, a lot better front feel on the front of the car while you're driving. You can't do that on the xDrive cars because the front subframe is different to account for the front diff, the transfer case, the axles, and all that sort of stuff. And talking about that front subframe, another difficulty that introduces is that since there's more stuff going on in the front of the car, that subframe is different, it's shaped differently, it makes doing certain jobs on this car a whole lot more difficult than it is on a rear-wheel drive version. For example, if I want to put downpipes on this car, it's very difficult to do it. There's not enough room, and you actually have to lower the front subframe in order to fit downpipes in there, something you don't have to do on the rear-wheel drive cars. Another example is the oil pan gasket. That always leaks on these 3 Series. It's a notorious problem. It happens all the time as they get up into the higher mileage. It has to be addressed at a certain point. It's a considerably larger job on the xDrive cars than it is on the rear-wheel drive cars, again, because you got more stuff going on up there. We're now in the car to discuss one of the last things that I wanted to go over, which is the steering rack. So on the xDrive versions of these cars, they have the slowest version of the steering racks that BMW put into this generation of 3 Series. So you would have your M3 has the fastest rack, meaning that if you turn the steering wheel 90 degrees, that equates to a sharper steering angle than it would on a slower rack. So the M3 has the fastest rack. Then the rear-wheel drive version has a rack that's not quite as fast as the M3's, but it's still a decently quick rack. And then you get to the xDrive, which has the slowest rack of them all. And again, what that equates to is you as a driver having to give more steering input to get the same degree of steering angle as you're going through corners. And really, you're not going to notice it a whole lot of the time. I typically don't notice that it's a slower rack in this car as I'm just driving around town. With xDrives, you do also have a wider turning radius, and I think that's more of a factor of having front axles. You just can't physically turn the wheels as much. The geometry of the control arms and whatnot doesn't allow for that versus the steering rack. But again, around town, don't really notice a whole lot different with the steering rack, but you will notice it if you're driving spiritedly on a tight, windy back road. And then the last part of that is you're again limited in the modifications that you can make. I mentioned earlier the control arms modification with the M3 control arms that a lot of people do. A lot of people with the rear-wheel drive version of this car will also put in the M3 steering rack, so they have the faster, more aggressive rack. You can't do that on the xDrive cars, and you can't do it because, again, that front subframe is different, the rack is mounted up differently, and it simply just does not fit. So in closing, what are the key takeaways here? Well, first of all, I probably sounded like throughout this video, throughout the things that I've been saying, that I've kind of been talking down on the xDrive system a good amount, and I don't want that to be the ending impression of the system, because it is actually a very impressive all-wheel drive system. I took this car up to Lake Placid this past winter, and up there it's just snow is everywhere. They just don't even bother plowing it, they get so much of it. And this car with the all-wheel drive and the dedicated snow tires, it was an absolute monster, an absolute beast. Nothing was stopping on the roads. I was able to get up these crazy roads. If you want to hear more about that, check out my video that I'll link above, talking about how xDrive does in the snow. But it's a very, very impressive system, and if you're going to be using it for the capabilities that the system provides, it is something that is worth getting and worth optioning or looking at when you're looking at one of these cars. Now for me, I tend to kind of sound like I'm talking down about it because I bought this car primarily for the sports car experience that you get from a lot of BMWs, the real driver's experience that you get from BMW, especially the older BMWs, and the E90 generation, I think, offers a lot of that. But when you get into the all-wheel drive system, the xDrive models, there are compromises that are made in terms of those things and in terms of that driving experience that take away from some of the enthusiast side of me. One of the other reasons you might want to go with the xDrive system is if you're going to be pushing big power out of these cars. If you have an N54 335i and you're going to be making big numbers, some people want the stability that the all-wheel drive offers. These cars come with an open rear diff, the rear-wheel drive versions, and this one as well, but they come with an open rear diff. And when you're pushing that much power, the power that the 335s are capable of, it can be pretty unstable when you have an open diff. So for that reason, some people might go with the xDrive versions. Again, if it was me and I was going to be spending the time and money to invest in the car to make that much power, I'd spend the time and money to invest in an LSD swap and put an LSD in the rear-wheel drive version. But again, that's just me and how I would do things. So I hope this video was helpful. Again, I wanted to kind of just lay out all the things that are the key differences between the rear-wheel drive versus the xDrive version of these cars. So if you're looking at one of these cars and potentially going to buy one and you're considering whether to go with a rear-wheel drive or an xDrive, you have all that information out there. That was really my goal, and every person's different. Everybody has a different configuration that best suits them. So keep everything that I said in mind and just take it with a grain of salt and apply it to your individual situation. But that's gonna be pretty much it for today, guys. Thanks for tuning in. It's a beautiful day. You can see this is the first time all year that I've worn a t-shirt. It's a great feeling. It's almost 70 degrees out at the end of March in the Northeast in Connecticut. So it is a phenomenal day. I'm out for a drive. And what that means is that spring is here, and that means for car guys that we get to do all of our spring cleaning, catch up on any maintenance, do a little bit of detailing, and there are going to be videos coming soon on all that sort of stuff as I get into it. So thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time. Peace.